Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm Katie Rackett-Fialka, and today I'm talking with Dr. Ashley Whitehead Luskey, who is an historian of the Civil War in 19th century America and an independent historical consultant. Ashley's here to talk to us a little bit today about Civil War Richmond. She's going to talk to us a little bit about what Richmond was like before the war and about some of the changes that the war created. And more specifically, she's going to tell us about some of Richmond's more rowdy inhabitants. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you, Katie.
So let's hear a little bit about some of these stories. And I know you have a lot of great context for us as well. So how would you describe the seedy side of Civil War Richmond?
Well, I think in order to fully understand the contours of Civil War Richmond, we really need to understand what Richmond was like on the eve of the war. Richmond in 1860 is really a city in transition. It's a city coming of age. It's a city that's very industrial, has a thriving industrial economy. In fact, it has a number of mills and factories, especially flour mills, tobacco factories, woolen mills. It also has the famed Tredegar Iron Works, which supplies, of course, about 50% of the cannon ultimately during the wartime effort itself for the Confederacy. But during the war, this industry is really kind of a hallmark of industrial slavery taking hold in Richmond and in other cities like it throughout the South. So it really is kind of more of a modernizing place than we might usually think of southern cities on the brink of war. Because Richmond was economically diverse, it did have, of course, a large number of people constantly moving in and out of the city. It's really known as a very thriving port city. In fact, in 1860, you'd think with all of this that all these changes would be upsetting to Richmonders because these are a lot of changes for the time period. There is some vice, there is some crime going on in the city, but for the most part, that crime is largely kept in check, and kind of the social disarray that you might think of as happening during this very transitional time period is really kept in check, largely by official conduits, very effective police force. Also, the mayor's court keeps crime in check. But there's also a very strict, very rigid social hierarchy. And that hierarchy keeps people kind of in their place. People know where they belong, and that's not only on a social level, but also in terms of what public spaces they can and cannot access. So that's important for keeping Richmond stable. However, fast forward to the war years, and all of that seems to kind of start sliding by the wayside. In 1861, of course, we have the advent of the war. We have the capital moving to Richmond in May of 1861, and with it comes just this influx of very diverse people. We have, of course, soldiers. We have numerous generals, we have politicians and their wives. We also have a very large population of refugees. We have a large number of slaves and free blacks who are coming into the city, and they're working in, wartime industries. And of course, with all of these people, we have kind of the less savory sort moving in. We have people who some historians have called confidence men moving in. And these are speculators, these are men who try to dress up and deceive other people into thinking that they're of the respectable class. They try to establish business relations and basically get people out of their money during the war. They see this as an opportunity. With them comes along another kind of unsavory class for wartime Richmond, and that is, of course, women from the world's oldest profession, prostitutes. They come in by the trainloads as soon as the capital is moved to Richmond. And with them and the confidence men comes really an influx in crime and vice that becomes quite problematic. Now, at first, people in Richmond see the war as kind of another transition, an exciting transition to go through. But gradually, they start to realize that along with all these changes, along with kind of the economic vitality that comes at the start of the war, comes a lot of change as well. The population explodes. It goes from 38,000 at the start of the war to almost 150,000 by the end of the war. So that's a huge, huge influx. And of course, with all these people coming in, you have overcrowding, you have competition for resources, You have disease, you have poverty, you have starvation, but you also have something which really threatens Richmond perhaps in a way like no other, which is the social threats that these people pose to the city. You have really kind of an unraveling of this social hierarchy that Richmond had depended on prior to the war to keep things in check, to keep vice down. So we have this kind of dangerous mixing of classes and races, or dangerous, as the wealthy leaders of Richmond would say. We have kind of a strangerification that happens in Richmond as well, which is that social hierarchy that they had prided themselves on before the war, where everyone knew everybody else in their place, that's breaking down. And this is really quite a threat. Now, to give you an example of some of the ways that this was threatening, as I said, we have kind of new classes of people taking over public spaces. Capitol Square, prior to the war, was kind of the playground of the elite. This was where wealthy people would come, they would promenade, they'd stroll, they would sit on benches and just kind of enjoy the weather. Now we have people of all different classes walking Capitol Square. We have prostitutes kind of soliciting soldiers for sex. We have African Americans as well parading around Capitol Square. And this is really perceived as a huge threat to Richmond's upper classes. We also have, though, in addition to places like Capitol Square getting kind of taken over by these people, we have specific districts cropping up in Richmond that I kind of refer to as red light districts because of the seedy behavior going on there. And some of those districts had some quite alluring names. One of them was called Pink Bottom. One of them was called, Pink Alley. Another one was called Sugar Bottom. And another one was called Solitude. And in Solitude, this was perhaps one of the more famous districts. This was an area of Carey Street, if anyone's familiar with Carey Street, located between 6th and 8th Streets, where basically it was den after den of vice. It was brothels, it was gambling houses, it was places of ill repute, places where people would get drunk and commit violent crimes on a nightly basis, and supposedly a place that was so wretched, with what one of the newspapers described as the sound of the screechy violin echoing into the evening, and satin slippers dancing on the floor all night long, that even the night watchman would turn away. So, we have a lot of what they called in the 19th century making the night hideous. And this would, of course, occur during the day and during the night. What's also problematic about these districts is that they're spreading not only into Capitol Square and kind of the high ground, which had been, as I said, kind of the area, the residential area of the more upper class residents, but they're also spreading into more common spaces frequented by middle and upper class men and women. The theater is kind of a perfect example of a public space where, prior to the war, there's a very strict kind of ordering in terms of seating. Poorer members would sit in kind of the second and third tier balconies. This would include, of course, African Americans. It would only be wealthier members and also people escorted by a lady who would be allowed into kind of the more premier areas of the theater. Well, during the war, we start to have raucous, drunken fights that break out in the theaters. There are prostitutes who infiltrate the ladies' boxes, and literally, they say in the newspapers, those boxes have to be fumigated after the prostitutes are thrown out. We have kind of elite seating being taken over by all these other kind of unseemly classes, and this really is a threat to people.
Now, what are some of the broader impacts of these changes on Richmond as a whole?
Well, we see a number of larger trends coming out of this. We have, of course, the fear of complete social unraveling, the unraveling of this hierarchy that has held society together for so long. We have the threat of class division. After the bread riots, especially of 1863, people are really concerned that the Confederacy is falling apart from within. They don't necessarily want to admit that to the public or to themselves, but they do see it, and they write about it sometimes in their private diaries and in their memoirs. They also have the threat of perhaps racial insubordination going on. You have these African Americans parading around with baubles of respectability. You also have instances of slaves actually setting houses on fire, committing acts of arson. You have incidents of slaves stealing more and more from their masters and their mistresses. And so that's really a threat too, especially as the war goes on and things aren't going necessarily the Confederacy's way on the battlefield. The Confederacy needs a united home front, and all of these things start to suggest that that united home front no longer exists. We also have, of course, this blurring of class lines, but also of public spaces. And this really shows the Civil War's upset of traditional boundaries. Southerners really went to war to defend these particular boundaries and these hierarchies, and as it turns out, they're no longer able to hold on to them as the war increases. There's also another problem in that the war is really forcing people to reckon with the idea of what is legitimate business. We have all of these different institutions cropping up, the gambling parlors, we have the brothels, we have the saloons. Some of the people who are rounded up begin to question the police commissioners and say, well, how is what I'm doing, participating in gambling, any different than what the speculator is doing? How is it any different from the businessman who is trying to basically take advantage of the war's opportunities? And these are troubling questions for people in Richmond. These are really troubling questions. So the question of legitimacy is also an issue. Now we also see, of course, showings of desperation amongst these people. Women, for instance, who would engage in prostitution. These are often lower class women who have no other way of making money. But we also see kind of displays of opportunism, particularly among some of the women who are in these bordellos and these brothels. There's one woman named Anna Thompson who runs a bordello on Carey Street, and she's extremely wealthy. And she runs her bordello according to her rules. She sees the bordello and the war as a time of opportunity, and she chooses to service whomever she wants. She uses the bordello to get perhaps valuable information out of men that she services about the war, and so she's really turning it more in her favor. Now, there are some efforts to try and rein in some of this vice and some of these problems. There are official efforts, there are more police that are put on the workforce to try and keep things in order. The mayor's court is constantly flooded throughout the war, with people being brought in for all kinds of offenses. But there are also unofficial efforts to try and curb some of what's going on. The women, the leading ladies of Richmond in particular, they take to the streets and they choose to promenade in perhaps a more forceful manner than they did before, trying to take back some of these public spaces, trying to assert their morals over what they see as the decaying morality of Richmond. They host a number of public receptions at their houses, particularly Verena Davis, the First Lady of the Confederacy. She invites everybody to come to the White House on numerous occasions, and this is an opportunity for her and for fellow women of her class to kind of case the population of Richmond, but also to try and reimpose her authority, their authority, over the Confederate capital as a whole. Now, this doesn't necessarily always work, and as the war years go on, these upper-class women, with their men, of course, preoccupied by the war itself, in politics or on the battlefield, these women get very disillusioned by what they're seeing. So ultimately, the big result with all of this is that by the end, April 1865, we have a city that looks entirely different from the way it looked at the start of the war. Of course, we've had the evacuation fires, so we have the destruction of about 10% of the city physically, but Richmond looks very different in its complexion in terms of who is out on the streets publicly, in terms of who is participating in these public activities, who is being seen on the streets in Capitol Square, by the market. It looks really, really different. Now, this is very difficult for elite members of Richmond to swallow. Not only do they have to deal with Confederate defeat, but now they have to deal with a city that basically looks like a world turned on their heads. And so in order to deal with this emotional pain, this social anxiety that they see, the threats of their entire world just completely falling down around them at the end of the war, they start to resort to either their pens, through newspaper writings, through memoirs, diaries, but also through monumentation and memorialization efforts to try and recreate the story of Richmond during the war as they wanted to remember it. And the story of how they remembered it is actually very different from how it existed. They portray a Richmond that was very united. There were no class divisions. There were no racial threats. Everybody knew their particular social place. There was never a question about who was going to win the war. These people didn't want to have to think about the role that these divisions played in society and potentially played in Confederate defeat. And so you have them whitewashing the war and creating some of these lost cause narratives that still exist today, and creating a city that, as one newspaper said in Richmond after the war, was completely, quote, enthralled to its past. And quite frankly, nothing could be more true.
Very good. Thank you so much for your time, Ashley.
Thanks for having me, Katie.